All right, chapter 9 of Gatsby. Today I'm filming in my son Timothy's room, and this is the last final chapter. So, the climax was the previous chapter where Gatsby was murdered by Wilson, and then Wilson committed suicide. So, chapter 9 would be the denouement, the unraveling of the knot, the resolution, the conclusion, the filling in of the gaps. So, we do find out from Nick that he's telling this story 2 years later. So, it's 1924, and he's looking back on the summer of 1922. And he remembers the day of Gatsby's murder as a day filled with police officers, an endless drill of photographers and newspapermen. The way it gets resolved is that Wilson was just a deranged man. Catherine, Myrtle's sister, says she lies and says that she was perfectly happy with her husband. And so they just write it all off as not revenge, but just, he was distraught with grief. And Tom and Daisy leave. Daisy never stops by Gatsby's, doesn't send flowers or anything. She sinks back into her wealth with Tom. And in fact, at the end of the chapter, Nick on page 179 says they were careless people. Tom and Daisy, they smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money and their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. So Fitzgerald's making a commentary for sure on the upper class and how they are not moral or ethical any more so than Gatsby was for being a bootlegger to get his money. So old money versus new money, it doesn't really matter. Money corrupts. That seems to be the theme. Gatsby's father, Henry C. Gatz, he arrives. So we never knew about Gatsby's parents other than they were shiftless farmers and they were poor. And of course, Gatsby himself had told others that they had died and he had inherited their money. But it's a September day, and as soon as Henry Gatz reads in the newspaper that his son has died, he makes the journey over to West Egg, and he's looking for his son Jimmy. I think this scene with Gatsby's father is really important to shaping Gatsby's character here at the end of the novel. Even though Gatsby lied about their death and his origins, and he was obviously embarrassed of his upbringing, he still loved his parents, and he bought them the house that they live in now, according to Henry Gatz. So he would send money home and help his family. Obviously, his dad is very proud of him and the wealth that he's accrued, and he shows a picture of the house that Gatsby had sent home, and that Gatsby just was destined for great things. And he shows his list of self-improvement that he wrote in 1906, and Gatsby's father just says, "That just shows you." And Nick says, "That just shows you." So this scene with the father is important. I think it shows us that Gatsby was a real, genuine, authentic, nice man, but he was caught up in a dream, and in order to achieve that dream, he had to cheat to get ahead, and all it ended up doing was leading to his demise. The only person putting together the funeral is Nick. Nick's scrambling. Nick is really Gatsby's only friend. And there's Klipspringer, you might remember, the boarder. He's the one who had just moved on into Gatsby's place without asking permission, and he would play music, of course. And when he calls, Nick is so thrilled. He's like, "Oh gosh, the funeral's tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Of course you'll be there." But of course, all Klipspringer wants is someone to send him his shoes. He's moved on somewhere else. So Gatsby's left with nobody after his immense generosity through throwing his parties and letting people stay in his home. Nick goes and tries to recruit people to attend Gatsby's funeral, and one person in particular that he reaches out to is Wolfsheim. So Nick tries to communicate through phone call messages, and finally he has to visit his office, and his secretary lies and says, well, he's in Chicago, but then she can hear him through the door. And so he busts on into the office, and Wolfsheim does say, "My memory goes out to when I first met him, and I raised him up out of nothing, right out of the gutter." So sure enough, once Gatsby had returned to the United States from the war, Wolfsheim had sort of adopted Gatsby figuratively and helped raise him up, even though he was penniless, but he was handsome and educated. And so Nick says, "Well, he's dead, and you're his closest friend, so you're going to come to his funeral this afternoon." And Wolfsheim says, "No, I can't do it. Can't get mixed up in it." And he says, "Well, let's learn to show our friendship for a man when he's alive and not after he's dead." And so that's that. Wolfsheim doesn't come to the funeral. It's a rainy day, the day of his funeral, and nobody came except Nick, Gatsby's dad, and Owl Eyes, who shows up late. Owl Eyes was the guy from the library who, symbolically, he had big glasses on. He parallels the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg, but also he's the only one who can see Gatsby's authenticity. He picked up on it in the library when he realized those books were real, and so he comes to the funeral, and he took off his glasses, wiped them outside and inside, probably crying, and he says, "That poor son of a bitch." So Al Wise is the only other person who comes to Gatsby's funeral. What's oddly prophetic about this is F. Scott Fitzgerald only had 25 people attend his funeral. So The Great Gatsby was hugely popular in the 20s, but then when the Great Depression hit, people didn't want to read about the jazz age and people getting drunk and this frivolity. So this went out of print until the 1940s when people were recovering from the Depression. So when F. Scott Fitzgerald died, he was a drunk. He had many inebriated moments in Grove Park Inn in Asheville. When he died, only 25 people came to his funeral, and the people who had written obituaries were scathing about him, about how he just didn't understand what true struggle and strife was like. So it's weird how prophetic and parallel Gatsby is to Fitzgerald's real life. Nick tells us a little bit more about how he attained closure with Jordan on page 177. So before he moves back west, he wraps things up with Jordan, and turns out she might be engaged to another man anyway. But she admits that she seemed to have real feelings for Nick, and she was surprised by his abrupt breakup. And she says at the bottom of 177, "I thought you were an honest, straightforward person. I thought that was your secret pride." And indeed, Nick told us at the end of one of the early chapters that he's one of the only honest people he knows. And Nick says, "Well, I'm 30. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honest," which could mean I still stand by the fact that Nick might be a homosexual character. We wouldn't have had many of these in the 1920s, but of course there were homosexual people. And so even though it's not blatantly stated, Nick's no longer going to fool himself. He was in love with Gatsby, But one afternoon late in October, he does bump into Tom. And Tom tries to be nice. He sticks out his hand to shake his hand, and Nick snubs him. And he says, "What's the matter with you, Nick? Do you object shaking hands with me?" And Nick says, "You know what I think of you." He's like, "You're crazy as hell. I don't know what the matter is with you." And he says, "Well, what did you tell Wilson that afternoon?" And Tom doesn't seem to know that Daisy was driving that car. Tom says, "I told him the truth. He was crazy enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who had owned that car." And he says, "That fellow," talking about Gatsby, "had it coming to him. He threw dust into everyone's eyes, just like he did Daisy's, but it was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over the dog and never even stopped his car." So it seems like to this day, Tom believes that Gatsby's the one that killed Myrtle. Now, that's interesting. That means Daisy hasn't been forthright with her husband. So even though Daisy seemed to be this pure white character from the beginning, she has her own corruption too. She has that yellow center to her flower. She caused a lot of this damage. And it's funny that Tom says that he cried when he went to get rid of his penthouse apartment in New York. He encountered a damn box of dog biscuits, and he sat there and he cried like a baby. So Tom had real feelings for Myrtle. So the chapter and the novel ends really philosophically from Fitzgerald's point of view about the American dream. Nick returns to Gatsby's, and he notices where some kids have scrawled graffiti on his white marble steps, and the grass is overgrown. And it's nighttime. In the moonlight, he can see. And so Nick wandered on down to the beach, and he thinks about how that green light was this huge sense of hope for Gatsby as he was trying to recapture that 5-year dream of Daisy. And then he extrapolates that to the Dutch sailors and the green grass, the green land, and how it was this new world, this location for human dreams. And he thinks about the capacity of wonder. As I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out that green light at the end of Daisy's dock. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future, the year-by-year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. That last line is one of the most famous lines in literature. And essentially, it seems to be stating that as humans and as Americans, we're always reaching forward toward impossible dreams, and we're always being dragged back by the current, but that doesn't keep us from reaching forward. So So Gatsby's dream of Daisy was truly impossible. It was never going to work out. She'd already developed a future with Tom, and she had a child, and she settled into her wealth. But that didn't stop Gatsby from pursuing her endlessly and for going for that impossible dream. And in a lot of ways, the American dream for a lot of people is impossible, and they can't always attain rags to riches wealth. So, just an interesting ending to an interesting novel, and I sure hope that I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.